by the microphone. So thanks for folks for coming again to another part of our lecture series on materials and health and environmental impacts of materials and material supply chains. And so just to catch everybody up on what we've been doing, for folks who may be new to this thing, we have a group of folks in the room and we have a large group of folks on the phone. So welcome to both groups. And our goal with this initiative over the last almost year and a half now has been to advance our understanding about the health and environmental dimensions of building supply chains, and to talk about things that we understand, and to talk about the things that we can do to make the discussion about the health and environmental attributes of building materials both common and impactful on decision making. And so as part of that series, we have been inviting thought leaders from across the country to join us and talk to us here at USGBC, and to talk with our kind of collection of stakeholders via web conference and streaming, to talk about what they're doing and their vision for a future where these issues are common and impactful. And today we have a continuation of that. Laura Heine's here to talk with us, and she's representing Clean Production Action and a variety of other affiliations, both volunteer and technical advisory. And just a few facts about, we're very privileged to have her and to have the benefit of her experience today. And so she is a fellow in the Green Chemistry program. She has a background working on with colleagues at Design for the Environment and US EPA. She's advised OECD and a variety of international bodies. And today she is one of the co-authors of GreenScreen, which is one of the most important and impactful tools that we have and we reference in LEAP version 4. And so she has a PhD in civil and engineering and a variety of technical background. And so with that, you have our attention for the next 45 minutes or so.
All right, thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.
Yep. And thank you to David and to Ashley, hi Ashley in California, for all your help with the arrangements. And let's see, Chris mentioned Clean Production Action, a nonprofit that works with NGOs, businesses, and industry leaders to deliver solutions in green chemistry and sustainable materials. And what I'd like to do today is walk through an overview of the GreenScreen, the project that I work on at Clean Production Action. I was co-author of this, and to give you insight about how it can be used to develop safer materials, and some examples and some of the challenges. Ashley and David asked me to talk about some of the challenges and not just the benefits here, and to not be afraid to get into some of the more technical scientific challenges as well. So one thing I love about architects and designers is they're undaunted by new material, new topics, and so I hope that you will enjoy the information. Okay, GreenScreen is an example of a method for chemical hazard assessment, or CHA. It supports the 12 principles of green chemistry. It builds on EPA Design for Environment and other national and international precedents. And importantly, it's open, transparent, freely available, publicly accessible, and peer-reviewed. And the genesis of it really came from the publication of the Principles of Green Chemistry, and the idea that one way to reduce risk is to control for exposure, but a less practiced way of controlling risk is by reducing the inherent hazards of chemicals and materials. And it takes both sides of this equation, right, to reduce risk, but there's a lot of blue sky, as they say, in terms of focusing on the hazards themselves. And so with respect to a timeline, some of the earliest work in this area was by the EPA Design for the Environment program, who pulled together partnerships of stakeholders to identify alternatives to things like flame retardants in furniture and in printed circuit boards, and alternatives to, say, DECA, brominated diphenyl ether. And through these partnerships, EPA developed this table, which was known as the matrix. And the matrix allowed people to see a chemical and see a hazard profile of that chemical. So that says cancer, skin sensitization, et cetera, and moderate, low, or high. And this was really an important stake in the ground in terms of as communicating information. The first DFE report was about 1,000 pages long. And when all the information could get boiled down to this little table, that was a huge step. But people were asking questions like, how do I know which chemical is better? If you look at this hazard table, you can see that none of them are all green and none of them are all red. How do you pick a chemical when you have trade-offs to make? And so at the same time, states like Washington were looking to ban certain chemicals, particularly DECA, brominated diphenyl ether. But they wanted to make sure that, one, the available alternatives were available, and two, they were in fact safer. They didn't have to be perfect, they just had to be better than the incumbent. And that combination of the work that DFE was doing with the needs of the state led to the genesis of the first GreenScreen report, version 1, around 2007. And that was looking at alternatives to DECA in television casings. That was followed in about 2011 by EPA Design for the Environment publishing their alternatives assessment criteria, which was very much informed by GreenScreen, and then the publication of version 1.2, which is very much informed by DFE. So there's a little bit of the history. So I would imagine that most of you are here because of your interest in buildings and in LEED, and LEED now offers 2 credits for material health. And these credits, as hopefully this isn't too redundant, but one focuses entirely on reporting of ingredients and products. The other focuses on optimization of products with an eye to those ingredients. And they're separate. And you can earn both credits or either one. And it's important to note that for the reporting credit, it applies to 20 different permanently installed products, and you would screen those products to 1,000 parts per million. For the optimization credit, it applies to 25% by cost of products, and you screen them all the way down to 100 parts per million, which is quite challenging. So, I think this credit, there's not a lot of language in the credit, but it sure represents a lot of thought and hammering out of ideas. And I think what's really nice about it is that it's intended to get people on a path of disclosure, assessment, and optimization. So the first part of the credit really asks, what's inside? What's the inventory of the product? And then what can you disclose about what's readily known about the hazard? So it's a really nice flow here. And then what else do we know about hazards? If you dig deeper and do a deeper assessment, what else can you find out about the chemicals and how they behave within a material? And finally, how can you optimize a product based on your knowledge? You can't manage what you don't know, so once you know what's in it, can you optimize the product? And the tools that support that, from my perspective, the HPD, Health Product Declaration, is a really important standard and tool for the product inventory. For looking at the inventory plus known hazard list screening, the HPD, powered by Pharos, which is built on GreenScreen List Translator, is a really important tool for disclosing known hazards. Then moving to full ingredient hazard assessment, that's where you get into a full green screen and in cradle-to-cradle assessment as well. And GreenScreen and cradle-to-cradle can lead you to product optimization with a focus on ingredients, and cradle-to-cradle goes beyond that to also include a focus on renewable energy and water and social elements as well. But in terms of product optimization through the GreenScreen and Cradle to Cradle can point you to those credits. So there are two GreenScreen tools that have evolved. The first is a full GreenScreen method, and the second is the list translator. And I'm going to talk first about the full GreenScreen. It is a systematic evaluation of chemicals based on about 18 hazard endpoints. You can add more, for example, bird toxicity or worm toxicity, depending on the type of product and if it's appropriate. And it's a really good tool for identifying not only chemicals of concern, but inherently safer chemicals. It's a very comprehensive approach. And it does require technical expertise to do it. There are 3 steps to doing a GreenScreen assessment. The first one is, it's the hard one, I think. It's the, assessing and classifying the hazards. There's a lot of research that needs to happen here. The second one is applying the benchmarks. And the third one is making informed decisions. So here are the hazard endpoints. The group 1 endpoints tend to be severe health effects and chronic effects that can be affect development and future generations. The group 2 health effects tend to be more potency based, like you know, everything has acute toxicity at some level, but it has to do with the potency. And then here, environmental toxicity and fate includes persistence and bioaccumulation. And then physical hazards are important too, because that affects workers, whether it's reactive or flammable. The endpoints in GreenScreen came from global authoritative sources, including OECD screening information sets, EPA Design for the Environment, EPA New Chemicals, globally harmonized system of classification and labeling. You're going to hear a lot about that. It's also called GHS. And they are now on their 5th revised edition. And also international regulations such as Canadian DSL, the European Union REACH legislation, things like that. And the point was that we didn't really want to reinvent the wheel if we didn't have to. There's enough to do to comply with international requirements. And so the only places where we made additions in the GreenScreen was in the area of endocrine activity, because EPA really didn't have criteria for endocrine activity and did not include it in the early reports. They do now as a literature review. Some of the physical hazards typically weren't in material assessment protocols. Prioritization of health effects, breaking them into group 1, group 2. And also, GreenScreen deals with environmental transformation products, which I'm not going to talk a whole lot about. But some chemicals can be more problematic when they break down than they are as a parent compound. And some are not. Some break down quickly to benign ingredients. So it's important to at least look. That was one of the issues with DECA-BDE, that it was breaking down into the lower congeners. Things like nonylphenol ethoxylates break down into nonylphenol. So it's important to be aware of that and capture that. So I'll get a little bit technical here for a moment, but there are 3 general criteria types that are used in the GreenScreen. There are threshold-based criteria, evidence-based criteria, and hazard lists. So when I say threshold, I mean numerically based, test-based. Here's an example of persistence, where if a chemical had a half-life and degraded, say, in 20 days in the soil or sediment, then it would be moderate for persistence in soil. And you would take the more conservative values, whatever you had. So here you have a range. And these values here, for example, the 10-day ready biodegradable, 10-day window and ready biodegradation, that's a very specific OECD test that can be used to determine if something If it passes or fails that test, then it would be very low for persistence. So that's a threshold-based criterion. Carcinogenicity is an example more of an evidence-based criterion where you might see a chemical identified as a known carcinogen or a presumed carcinogen or even a suspected carcinogen. There's no numerical thresholds for most carcinogens. It sort of is, or it isn't, or it might be. And then there are lists. And here, for example, IARC. If something is an IARC group 1 or 2A carcinogen, then it would be flagged as high for cancer in the GreenScreen. So those are examples of the 3 kinds of criteria that you run into. All right. So what you do is you do a lot of research and you evaluate every single endpoint and come up and then apply the GreenScreen criteria and then fill out this hazard table. And so here in this case, this example chemical is low for cancer, low for mutagenicity, moderate for developmental toxicity. DG means there's a data gap. That means you looked everywhere, you tried to model it, you tried to look for analogs and read across, couldn't find any information, so it's a data gap. Low means you had evidence that it's a low hazard. And so you fill out this hazard table, and where, this is based on DFE, but where there's a bold letter, that means it's based on high confidence, or it's high confidence. Where it's like italic, it's lower confidence. So once you have your hazard table, you can go on to the next step, which is applying the benchmarks. And these benchmarks this is the subjective part of the GreenScreen. And the benchmarks are aligned with regulatory drivers. So it really came out of what the European Union was calling a substance of very high concern, or an SVHC, under REACH. And those tend to be carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive, developmental toxicants, PBTs, equivalent concern. So what you do here is you would look at your hazard table and say, is it high for persistence or higher? Is it high for bioaccumulation or higher? Is it high for various toxicity endpoints and higher? If so, then yes, this is a benchmark 1 chemical. If not, go on and ask the next question. Is it very persistent and very bioaccumulative? If no, go on to the next question. Is it, and then is it high for any of the group 1 endpoints? If any of these are true, it's a benchmark. If none of them are true, you go on to benchmark 2 and go through the same type of algorithm. Whoops. And benchmark 4 would mean it would be low hazard across the board. And there are exceptions for inorganics for persistence. So persistence doesn't count against inorganics when the hazards are low. So this logic reflects the logic of governments around the world of what is an SVHC, right? So it might not reflect something that is highly explosive, right? That wouldn't be a benchmark 1 chemical. It's dangerous, but it's not benchmark 1 because it doesn't reflect that government prioritization. If something is a benchmark U, that means there weren't enough data to classify it, so undetermined. All right. So this is useful because people who are not toxicologists can use the benchmark system, 1 through 4, 1 bad, 4 good, nice and easy. It's good for, you can use it to phase out certain types of chemicals. You can use it to prefer other kinds of chemicals. I'll give you a couple of examples. Nice, simple, high-level metric. But I'll show you a GreenScreen report in just a moment, too, to show that you can do a lot more with it. So, but what we're really trying to do is avoid going from the frying pan to the fire. You want to avoid regrettable substitutions. When a company is looking to replace a chemical of concern, you want to make sure you're replacing it with something better. So what are some of the challenges with the full GreenScreen? I'd sort of share with you some of the warts here. One of the challenges I was just talking to Cal about is polymers. The polymer exemption rule really doesn't require data. And so most polymers don't have any data. That can be really challenging, and there's work that needs to be done there. Also, what happens when you have data gaps? Sometimes you get a benchmark U, and that's a very unsatisfactory score on a full green screen. And there's a lot of work being done now in what some call green toxicology, the use of predictive models, high throughput screening, computational toxicology, some really exciting work on can you assess the hazard properties of a molecule even before you make it. And the same tools you would use to evaluate a new molecule, even one you haven't made yet, are the tools you would use to fill a data gap for existing molecules that just don't have data. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. The Tox21, ToxCast are generating lots and lots of information about modes of action and biological pathways, but there's no clear consensus yet on what that means, how to use it directly to inform decision making, because people are making decisions every day on materials, right? And you have to choose. And so we need to bring forward some of the best tools to help people make better decisions. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done too on how to decide on the hazard of a chemical that has lots and lots of data. Sometimes the data are inconsistent. How do you weigh good data versus bad data? That's challenging. And sometimes a chemical has very, very little data, and you just use what you've got. So you could be dealing with very high confidence, very low confidence, and still making decisions about materials. So those are challenges. Some challenges around transformation products. You want to be capturing those things that really matter. Are they feasible? Is this chemical likely to, say, transform into something problematic in the water? Is it even likely to get to the water? Those are questions. You hear a lot about combustion products from electronics, right? You know, making dioxins and things like that. Well, you don't typically worry about combustion products from soaps. So you have to make sure that what you're dealing with really has a particular path and it's really probable. But it's very difficult to measure how much is going to form. Is it a lot? Is it a little? So there's more work that needs to happen around transformation products. Mixtures, things like acids and bases. Are we talking about glacial acetic acid, or are we talking about the vinegar you put on your fish and chips? You know, it's the same chemical with water. How do you compare those? And then some of the trade-offs that you're going to have to make. Good alternatives may not always be available. Sometimes they're just a little better. Sometimes they're a lot better. Sometimes you might even choose one that doesn't have a great profile, but it's the best hazard profile for the product you're using. So, for example, perhaps it's quite toxic to fish, but if you're pretty sure it's never going to see water, maybe that's the best choice, that kind of thing. One alternative green screen approach that I think is very helpful to people is to use this hazard template that indicates the exposure route. So this is a green screen hazard table for potassium permanganate. And you can see here that it's hard to read, but the developmental toxicity through the oral route is higher than the developmental toxicity through inhalation and dermal. And so seeing the exposure route hazards is a really good way to help somebody design a product. So if you're making a skincare product and you don't have any data on skin sensitization, you might really need to get data, or maybe it's low for skin toxicity, and that could inform your choice about a chemical. So I think it's important. But when in the early days of GreenScreen, you're lucky if you had data for any exposure route, never mind all of them. So I think that's a good sign of progress that we're able to do assessments and show data by hazard route. And then this one, I just wanted to show you, one of the most common questions we get is, what do I do if I have benchmark two chemicals? And I usually just turn it back to people and said, well, what would you do if you have benchmark two chemicals? You have the benchmark score, and that's a very high level. It conceals a lot of important information. You also have the hazard table. So here you have, this is an additive to a polymer. It was a benchmark 1. These are both benchmark 2s, but you can look at the hazard table and compare them. And at first it just looks like a bunch of colors, but when you start to dig into it and say, well, gosh, systemic toxicity, 2 data gaps. Is that real? That's not really a good thing. You know, it means you have no data about the continued exposure to this thing. And then this one is, that's high persistence. And it's got some ecotoxicity. That's not always a good combination. And you can just kind of go through it and think through what are the hazards and what is appropriate for the particular application. So I think it's important. And then I'm going to show you a green screen assessment, what it looks like, because as they say, a picture, what is that expression? A picture is worth 1,000 words. Thank you. So this is a green screen assessment of DEHT. Oh, right, and thank you. David's going to pass around a couple of examples of these so you can look through it. But I'm just going to scroll through. This was done by Tox Services, which is one of our licensed profilers. So this is what an assessment looks like. The information first on the molecule and the types of uses, what it's used for. Here's a hazard table. This is one of the more benign plasticizers you'll ever see, DEHT. It's got a couple of data gaps, but so therefore the score it got was 3 DG, because we penalize things for having data gaps. So it would be a benchmark 4, but it can't be because it's got data gaps. So that's a very high scoring chemical. Then it tells you a little bit about it. It shows you, talks about transformation products, and every single hazard endpoint. So here, carcinogenicity is low, and then it summarizes the literature for the carcinogenicity and justifies why the toxicologist gave it a score for low. It shows that it wasn't on any of the specified hazard lists, et cetera, et cetera. So you can go into this as deeply as you want into a report. So yeah, you can look just at a benchmark score. Yes, you can look just at the hazard table. Here's another one. This one's for triphenylphosphate. This is a flame retardant. You can see this one has, it's very toxic to fish for acute and chronic, but it's not terribly persistent. And again, here's the transformation products and a summary of all the data, including at the end any models that the profiler did, things like that. So these are very rich. These can be very rich reports and reflect a lot of work. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how green screens are being used. And this has been some of the more interesting developments because we developed GreenScreen to be open, transparent, publicly accessible, and for the first couple of years we didn't even track who downloaded it, so we had no clue who was using it. So that's why I was rather surprised when USGBC called and wanted to use it in the standard, but we're finding there's all sorts of fabulous applications. It's being used to support state regulations. The state of Maine requires its use for baby products, finding alternatives to chemicals of concern. California will not specify any one method, but will view green screen assessment as a valid way to assess a hazard, amongst others. Washington uses it for their Children's Safe Products Act. It's used for materials procurement, Hewlett-Packard. I'll give you an example of that, GC3. The PINFA is the Non-Halogenated Flame Retardant Industry Association in Europe, and now there's one in the US, PINFA, Phosphorus Inorganic Nitrogen Flame Retardant Association. It's used as part of the Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals, how they prioritize chemicals for inherent hazard. Staples uses it as part of its corporate policy, and we're happy that USGBC is using it. You can use it towards cradle-to-cradle certification, and an eco-label in Sweden called TCO development. And those are a few examples. The I don't know, have any of you, how many of you are interested in alternatives assessment writ large? A few, yeah, okay. The Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse recently published a guide called the IC2 Alternatives Assessment Guide. And it's a group of about 10 states right now with input from federal government and others. And it's to help people with alternatives assessment. And the guide includes a protocol and different decision frameworks you can use. Once you identify a chemical of concern, it guides you through an initial evaluation and scope and identifying alternatives, and then talks about there are 7 different modules you can use, one of which is hazard, and that is based on GreenScreen. And there's performance, cost and availability, exposure, et cetera. Those are the 4 core modules. But you can also use materials management, social impact, life cycle, et cetera. So this is a really interesting guide. It's being tested now and tried and will continue to evolve. Hewlett-Packard is an example of one of the leading practitioners of GreenScreen. They're actually part of, I think, one of the reasons for it gaining more notoriety, because they approached us early on and said, we're interested in a pilot. Would you like to work with us? And we said, sure. And 6 months later, they came back and said, okay, we're done. Oh, okay. And they said, we like this method. We think it's great for organics. It has a few issues for inorganics. We're going to make this mandatory for our suppliers and roll it out to the electronics industry. Okay, so what they decided to do is that when they were forced to move away from a chemical of concern, whether that was through internal policies or global regulations like ROS or REACH, they wanted to make sure they chose better materials, not just, they didn't want to move from a regulated chemical of concern to an unregulated chemical of concern that could be potentially regulated down the road. Because they estimated that it cost them $5 to $50 million every time they pulled out a chemical from their enormous supply chain. So it's not something you really want to do twice, and if you do, you're probably not going to have your job the second time around. So they really wanted to find better things to get out ahead of the regulations. So what they did this first with looking for alternative wire and cable coatings, polymeric coatings, alternatives to PVC. They did this internally. They required that the material suppliers provide them with GreenScreen assessments of the wire and cable polymeric materials before they would be reviewed, and HP then determined whether or not these qualified to go on their preferred materials list. So they made it mandatory. The suppliers were responsible for the work. If in order to sell to HP, you needed to screen your materials and submit the results, and HP would select them or not accordingly, and also QC. And they've added other materials since. And so essentially what they did is they collected an inventory of possible materials, whether it's flame retardants or wire and cable coating, and broke it down into groups, and it makes it really easy for engineers or procurement folks if you say, okay, don't use benchmark ones, or look for the highest scoring examples from each category on our preferred materials list. It makes it easy. Here's a nice example. I hope Dwayne doesn't mind. I took this off of Prosoco's website, but it looks like they're now doing the same thing. It says material screening is now front and center in our product development process. We put our vendors on notice that we will extend preferences to materials that have been reviewed using the GreenScreen tool and strongly emphasize ingredient transparency. And I think we have a lot to thank USGBC for that as well. So I'm going to move on a little bit and talk here about the GreenScreen List Translator. The GreenScreen List Translator is, it readily identifies known hazards based on hazard lists. And this one's kind of a quick and dirty tool, but it's very useful. It doesn't necessarily require toxicology expertise to use it, but it does for some of the deeper interpretive work if you have a conflict. And the best part is it's automated. So what it does is it maps the chemicals in the GreenScreen criteria to an overall score. So I showed you earlier, say, the IARC list. If it's something as a IARC 1B, for example, then it would be high for cancer. Well, you can map that, a chemical to a list, to a hazard classification, and even to a benchmark. And that's exactly what this does. It does, software does this. So it's very good at identifying, quote, bad actor chemicals or known hazards. It gives you a sandbox to play with. You can test out different formulations, find out what's known. And it uses a different scoring system than the full GreenScreen. Instead of benchmark 1, 2, 3, 4U, it calls it LT1, which is essentially benchmark 1, LTP1, possible benchmark 1, LTU. Because when you're only using lists, you really can't get the gradation you can get with a full GreenScreen of 2s, 3s, and 4s. And typically, governments aren't in the business of generating lists for safer chemicals. DFE now is, but that was kind of new territory. Usually governments are regulating toxic chemicals, so the lists you see are, quote, known bads. That's why. So it's it was difficult as part of the development of the GreenScreen to find criteria for benign chemicals. That was the biggest challenge. So the list translator is automated in two sources. One is the Pharos Chemical and Material Library. Pharos has different components to it, so look for the CML, Chemical and Material Library. And you can enter a CAS number and it'll pull up all of the hazard lists associated with that chemical and will tell you the resulting LT score. The Works is a for-profit company. They have a software tool called GreenWorks, and that does the same thing, and it's kind of a slick tool. It allows you to screen many chemicals at the same time. It presents the results in a hazard table, which is really slick, but it's a very expensive tool, and I'm hoping that they'll change their business model to make this more accessible for this kind of application. I wanted to say something, just to give you a little background on the lists that are used in GreenScreen. There's a distinction between lists that are considered authoritative and lists that are considered screening. Authoritative is what it sounds like. It could be a governmental regulatory list. It could be a body like the National Tox Program that's authorized by governments to screen and identify chemicals, or IARC. Screening lists, they can be either they're less authoritative source, or they were developed using estimated results. For example, the Canadian DSL list was done primarily using models. So it's not intended to be absolutely definitive. It's to cast a broad net. And sometimes these chemicals are put on these lists because they require further testing. There are some indicators, but they need further testing. So it's important to distinguish between authoritative and screening lists, and also between what we call A lists and B lists. And A lists are lists that fit nicely in a box. Something is NTP, known carcinogen. It fits nicely into high for cancer, which fits nicely into LT1 or benchmark 1. The B lists, things like some of the endocrine disruption lists, are B lists because it might be high and it might be moderate. So you have a list of the same chemicals. This group of chemicals needs further discernment to determine if it is in fact high or if it is in fact moderate. So that's what a B list means. There's a little more wiggle room in there and it needs a little more attention. And one thing that's important to note is that we've established what we call trumping rules. Because if you use Pharos, for example, you're going to get a printout of, say you could try formaldehyde or something, you're going to get a printout of all the different sources that say it's a carcinogen, but they're not always all going to say the exact same thing. There's some that might actually call it a moderate carcinogen. Others will call it high for carcinogenicity. Some will be authoritative, some will be screening. So we developed these trumping rules that basically say authoritative lists trump screening lists, and the more conservative value of those more authoritative lists trump the less conservative value. So first, authoritative over screening, then take the more conservative value. So that's important to know because you will find that these national and international classifications can vary somewhat. If you take two countries using GHS, one may say it's a 1B, one may say it's a 2A. They're going to be very close, but Korea and Australia may not completely agree. Okay, what the list translator is not. It is not a full green screen assessment. It does not represent all the data. It does not review transformation products. It does not identify safer chemicals. That you need a full green screen assessment for, because it uses all the available data, models, QSAR, read across. You get much greater confidence with a full green screen. You can identify safer alternatives. But what's important, a full green screen lets you know what you know and know what you don't know. And sometimes it's as important to know what you don't know about a chemical hazard as what you do know about a chemical hazard. So to share some of the challenges of a list translator, as I mentioned, you can get competing results with classification lists, so that's why it's good to have the trumping rules. Some of the hazard lists can be overly conservative for certain chemical forms. So I'm sure you may have already run into this, but silica, for example. Are we talking about amorphous, crystalline, or beach sand? Sometimes the same CAS number will call up the same hazard regardless of the form, or nanoscale even. That's a problem. But remember, we're talking about a quick and dirty tool. And carbon black, same thing. Titanium dioxide, same thing. HBD that is working on this to really get deeper into the actual form and material. Sometimes you run into grouping issues around exposure. Petrolatum, Vaseline petroleum jelly, can show up as a carcinogen in Europe. You're like, really? So if you look deeper, you find out that if it's made a certain way, it's loaded with PAHs. If it's made another way, it's not. So the way they deal with that in Europe is you have to just document that you didn't use the polluting way of making petrolatum. So things like that. It can be a little overly conservative and you have to prove otherwise. Sort of guilty till proven innocent kind of thing. And ethanol, we all, probably most of us, appreciate that ethanol is a developmental toxicant, but you actually have to consume a fair amount of it. So something like CalProp 65 will flag ethanol through a specific exposure route. We're actually thinking about changing the classification of Prop 65 to an authoritative B list to allow for a little more discernment when these chemicals come up. But basically, when in doubt, a full green screen can always go deeper and resolve these issues. And it's okay, particularly for this lead credit, if there's just one endpoint in question, go to a profiler and have that one endpoint resolved. You don't have to have every endpoint resolved. If, say, for example, the issue is ethanol. Okay, so I'm just going to go quickly through this to go back to the lead credit and talk about, now that you have a better understanding, I hope, of the green screen and the list translator. For the ingredient reporting to 1,000 ppm, you can do it yourself. You can use the HBD. You can disclose the ingredients. If you're a manufacturer, you can disclose the ingredients yourself, as long as there's no trade secret information. If there is trade secret information, you need to go to a green screen profiler to have a full green screen done of the secret ingredients. And then you can just report the score and how it's used and the amount, but you don't have to identify what it is. That allows you to protect your confidentiality, but also some confidence in the results. And here's an example of the HBD builder and how they describe where the hazard list came from, which are derived from list translator through Pharos. For the optimization credit, you can also do this yourself if you're interested in earning, if you're interested in your product achieving 100% of the cost of the value. So you do it yourself by using the list translator. And if you enter in all the ingredients, say, for example, in the HBD, and you get back all LTUs, you're good to go. You just earned 2 credits. You just earn the right to be used towards those 2 credits. If you have a P1 or even a questionable benchmark 1, such as ethanol or something like that, you can go to a profiler and have that resolved. And then that's a nice, one of the things we wanted to do in working with USGBC is to make this as accessible as possible and as feasible as possible. To earn the highest level of credit, though, the 150% of cost, you would need to do a full GreenScreen assessment on every ingredient to 100 parts per million. This is the most credit, the most value, and the most challenge, and you would need to use a profiler for that. And these are the 3 profilers that we use. One is Tox Services. We have Ed here from Tox Services. And NSF Sustainability and Cyvera. There's a couple more who are now qualifying to become profilers in the US and also in Europe. And it's also nice that you can use GreenScreen assessments as information for cradle-to-cradle certification too. So it helps to get on the path. This can be an expensive certification, so if you've already done some hazard assessment work, you can take that work when you're pretty confident that your ingredient profile looks good. You can take that work to cradle to cradle and then add those other product attributes, the water, the social, the cyclability, etc. And Tox Services is an assessor for both GreenScreen and cradle to cradle, so that's a nice link there. And then here are some other resources you can use. We do provide some training. We just finished a 3-year project in the Great Lakes doing 2 workshops a year. And so that's over. So now we're going to be focused on developing online training for introductory GreenScreens. And we have an advanced class called the Certified Practitioner. This is for people who are trained in toxicology or environmental health and safety. It's pretty technical. It's hard. You end up doing 2 GreenScreen assessments yourself with coaching by a toxicologist. But what it allows you to do is do GreenScreens for your own company. It doesn't make you a profiler. It makes you qualified to even submit them for a verification from your own company. And so we will continue to offer webinars. You can go to the licensed profilers. The advantage of that is that they have a lot of expertise, they have credibility, and if you need to protect your suppliers, CBI, confidential business information, sometimes the only way they'll work with you is if you go through a third party. So they can be a third party. And the big thing that I really think we need to develop is making publicly available repositories of GreenScreen assessments. The #1 question we get is, where do I go to press a button to download, to find all of these GreenScreen assessments so I can use them? Because I hope that once you see the ones circulating around, you'll see that there's a lot of information, there's a lot of value, a GreenScreen assessment is a snapshot in time. They're good for 3 years, and then it's time to update them. You can update them sooner, and the reason is that new data are coming out all the time. With reach and play, you got to keep these up to date. Some things may never change, but some things that had data gaps may have new information. It's important to at least be aware of that. So we are going to be putting up on our website all the publicly available GreenScreens by functional use. So you'll be able to look for flame retardants or solvents or whatever. This is based on what EPA did, DFE did with their skill list, their safer chemical ingredient list. That's a really nice way to find safer ingredients. Pharos is going to be doing that as well, allowing you to actually link to GreenScreens through their software and through the HBD, which will be exciting. MIQ, a project of Green Blue, will be having a marketplace for materials, in part based on GreenScreen. And I'll just give you a quick glimpse of what IC2, that Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse, has done. They've created a repository by name and cast number only, where you can look up to see they're basically sharing GreenScreens between the states. You can click on a chemical name, it'll pull up the hazard table, and if you click again on that document, you can download the full assessment, and there's no cost for using that. So I think I'm doing okay for time. All right, to close, I like this quote by Jonathan Plisco of Poly1. It's not meant to be a corporate endorsement, but he said, the more you know about what you're putting into your products, the more likely you are to make better choices in product development. And I really think that's a key reason that chemical hazard assessment supports safer materials. And programs like USGBC's LEAD is really helping to drive the development of products towards greater transparency and inherently safer materials. So I think I will end on that and ask for questions. Oh, interesting. So not just in a particular product, but in the building itself. I would have to say no. It's a very, I've heard anecdotal stories about new materials going into some old buildings. I think this one happened in Europe, and interactions between chemicals that were unanticipated, and very nice green projects that ended up producing some toxic substances. Generally, we find things are not as interactive as you might fear, but it's certainly possible, and we have not gotten to that level. We're really just looking at individual products, chemicals and individual materials and individual products. But it's important work, and there's a really nice report by Ted Shetler called The Ecology of Breast Cancer, which I think is a great report, and it talks about, it's not entirely building specific, but it talks about how all these factors that are related to a disease work together in a kind of ecosystem. And he calls out certain chemicals and pesticides, but also lifestyle factors, like to what extent are you getting sunlight, exercise, food, vitamin D. And that, I think, is a very comprehensive approach to thinking about building health and health within buildings and beyond chemicals even. But it's a very good question, and I would be very interested if you had yourself any anecdotes or examples of where you've seen that as problematic. More beyond something is already known to be problematic and it's being additive with other sources of the same chemical kind of thing. Good question. Sure. Would you like to?
Just one of the first hurdles that we have for architects is that if things we're confronted, the architect, I think one thing you said was they make decisions about materials every day. They take to some degree for granted the things that they can just go out and procure, specify, or so forth. If they were really dangerous, the government would protect us from these things. And I think there's a degree of confusion for architects about why this set of information channels needs to exist at this point in time. What is it doing here? If it really was bad, isn't it okay? The architects, I mean, that's...
Right. Interesting. I guess, well, my first thought is I guess you could say that about buildings too. You can build, there are no laws against building, most kinds, as long as you meet codes, you can pretty much build whatever you want. You don't have to move to a green building by any means. So you're faced probably with some of the same challenges, so it's really building in the drivers to move toward. But I think that's the quick off the top of the head answer, but I think the other piece is that we're gaining a lot more understanding about impacts throughout the supply chain and across the life cycle of a product. So yes, it may be fine to use a particular chemical in the use phase, but what happens to it after use? I haven't seen that many. I've seen, I think, once in my entire life a risk assessment that really looked at additive effects. But I think it was Procter & Gamble who did this, decided not to use nonylphenol ethoxylates because they would use so much that they would load up the streams. And they recognized that after use was the problem for them. While a small user might do the same assessment and say, well, I just make a small amount of product, so I'm not going to have a negative impact. So the fact that they chose not to use a chemical that others did choose to use based on scale. So I think there's a challenge of scale too. We're dealing with big systemic problems, not immediate risks necessarily to people. And anyone else want to take a crack at answering that too? Go for it. You just introduce yourself.
Okay. This is Calthair Anderson. I'm with the EPA Design for the Environment program. And I think, going back to Chris's question, we have to remember that chemicals are regulated under the Toxic Substances Chemicals Act, which was, I think, put in place in '76. Yes. And tens of thousands of chemicals were grandfathered in. So that meant that they didn't get a regulatory review. So in order to regulate those chemicals, we do have to prove that there are risks associated with specific uses. So we're not just regulating chemicals, we're regulating uses. That gets to the research question, because so many chemicals, you can look at phthalates or formaldehyde or chemicals that are found in many different products. So how do we demonstrate that use in one product is what is causing the health effects? So it's a double burden. You have to prove a health effect, and you have to prove that the specific use is related to that health effect. And it's just really, really tough to do. Yeah. So with the new chemicals coming in, we do get a look at them. We have 90 days to review them, and we use all the tools that we have at our disposal to give them a review. But I think there are some hurdles.
That's cool. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Yep.
I want to piggyback on that and just say, do you know about, is there any legislation coming up that is going to regulate chemicals now more so in different products? Because I know I've heard that in Europe you can't put a chemical in a product unless it's on an approved list from an EU country. And I know we don't have that in this country. Do you know about it? Are they working on legislation for that?
Well, in Europe, it has to be, the legislation is called REACH. It stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization of Chemicals. So it has to be registered, no data, no market. So it's not, it doesn't have to be on a list per se, but it has to be registered. Well, probably the most recent example is California's Safer Consumer Products regulation. Now will be identifying specific products and specific chemicals that are identified that will need to do. Whoever makes those will need to do an alternatives assessment, and either demonstrating there are no alternatives or demonstrating the results from their alternatives assessment. But whatever those results, based on the results of the alternatives assessment, that chemical could be banned or restricted, or maybe it'll just help the market transform to a safer alternative. So that would be a recent US example. I wasn't going to show this slide, but I think I will based on Chris's question. It's my favorite slide, and I think this reflects, starting with step one, the path that a lot of people take to get on the path to material health. And a lot of times what happens is a chemical comes out, for example, bisphenol A in baby food products or something like that, and suddenly it's banned in a particular state, or it's negative perception in the consumers, or maybe it's regulated nationally, but people practice avoidance chemistry. They get rid of BPA and they think, phew, done. I've done it. I've got a green product now. And what you're doing is you're really complying with a higher level of compliance and reducing some immediate risks. But as soon as you do that, somebody will probably ask you, what did you replace it with? And if you say BPS, they might say, oh, did you know, well, there's no data on BPS, or did you know that BPS is very similar in structure to BPA and likely to have the exact same hazards, it just hasn't had as much attention. So you're in this zone now where you say, whoops, maybe I didn't do a good thing necessarily. What you want to do is you want to practice safer chemistry and ensure that the chemicals you are choosing are actually studied and you actually have some confidence that they are, in fact, better. And GreenScreen can be a good tool for that. It can reduce uncertainty. But even then, you might start pushing up against a wall, right? You might say, well, maybe there aren't any good alternatives. That exercise I showed you, going from the benchmark 1 to the 2 benchmark 2s, you might decide, like, well, I'm not real happy with either of these. And maybe there's nothing out there. And now you're looking to develop new molecules. You're working with suppliers saying, we need something that will work that isn't going to be hazardous to humans or ecosystems. So now you're in the business of developing new chemicals. But one of the clay feet, in my mind, of green chemistry is that it doesn't usually, new molecules don't always come with a lot of test data, right? They're brand new, no data. So that's why we desperately need these tools to allow for high throughput screening, predictive toxicology. What can we know about a molecule before we even make it? We don't have any of it. We can't put it in rat assays for 3 years or something. So we need to be able to predict and make new materials and to think about chemicals not only for just the inherent hazard of the chemical, but how it's used in a product. What are the exposure routes? What's the function? What's the exposure over the full life cycle? And start to think in terms of flows of chemicals and materials. Where are they going? Are they coming back? Are they going to the environment and degrading? So I think that's the challenge, is moving toward green chemistry, sort of the cradle-to-cradle or material, circular economy type approach is where we need to go. So I think that's the trajectory we are on, and it all starts with transparency and optimizing materials, I think.
Great. Well, I want to respect folks' time, and at first I want to thank Lauren for her remarks. I want you to just remember what a pleasure it is to have an international expert here to tell us where we're heading with this. So first, just give her a round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.